So for chapter 5, dealing with price controls, the first question doesn't even talk about whether it's a price ceiling or a price floor. It talks about if the government fixes the price of the good X above its free market equilibrium level. So we have a situation where we would have our typical free market level where the intersection of quantity and supply curve meet. If it's above it, let's say they set it above it. Well, if that's the case, if we kind of just draw one out really quick, you would see that if the price is set above this price here, which would normally be our equilibrium price, well, we could imagine that above this price, this is my supply, my demand curve, shouldn't go negative. So in that situation there, we would have an excess supply of that good, or we would have a surplus, is the other way to say an excess supply. Anything below would lead to a shortage. There's much more demand than supply, or an excess demand. So in this case here, we're dealing with a surplus of good X to occur. Another answer that could be potentially good is the idea that a black market could potentially arise, but it's not something that's necessarily going to happen. It all depends. So if you thought about that initially, it's not completely false. It's just not the best answer in this case. Hopefully on the exam, there's no question like this that has two potential answers that could work. If a binding price floor is in place and the demand curve for the product shifts rightward, one consequence would be what? So I think for questions like these, it's better to draw them out. So the big idea here, as was mentioned in the videos, is the idea that if you set a floor below, this is where you are, and a ceiling above, it has no impact. Because if I say the price cannot go below this and it's actually above it, it doesn't have an impact. So for the price floor to be binding, it has to be somewhere over here. So it tells me this is the price or higher. In that situation there, I have an excess supply going on. Well, what would happen if the demand curve were to shift right? Well, if the demand curve were to shift right, my excess supply now would be very small because this would have been the equilibrium price versus what it was before. So the actual excess supply is quite small compared to the whole distance that I had before. So we would have a decrease in the amount of the excess supply. Refer to figure 5.6. The market for good X is in equilibrium at P0, Q0. So this normal intersection. Now suppose the government imposes something which will result in a deadweight loss. So if for them to impose something, I said if this is a price floor, it's not going to have any impact because they could still keep charging P0. So this would have to be a price ceiling. 3 answers highlight that. And then it has to represent the deadweight loss. Well, the deadweight loss is always going to be this triangle because in the absence of this price ceiling, this was my total consumer surplus. The upper half being, this is consumer surplus. This is producer surplus below. So this is my total economic surplus or my social welfare. Well, as soon as I introduce this upper portion here would be my consumer surplus, my producer surplus. So what is lost? This is area 5 and 6 that are no longer present. So it would be a deadweight loss and not an increase in economic surplus. We're losing. Okay. In this question here, a price ceiling set at a price of $1 per unit. So once again, ceiling isn't having an impact. $1 per unit. Ceiling below U, that's not normal, so it has an impact. And here you have to understand what would be that shortage or surplus. Well, here I have an excess demand, which is a shortage, not a surplus of goods. And that shortage is of this distance, so between 30 and 10 units. So a shortage of 20 units. Last but not least, and sometimes you'll have a question like this that will surprise you. In a competitive market, a legal price ceiling set above the free market equilibrium will do what? Well, if it was set below, it would have an impact, but a ceiling above U actually has no impact because it says this is the maximum that you could charge, but the current price that you're charging is less than that. So if we were to say a price ceiling of $3 per liter on gasoline, well, right now the price is less than that. So because it's less than that, it doesn't have an impact. They will keep charging what they currently charge. So the answer that we're looking for is that it's just going to lead to a continuation of the free market equilibrium price and quantity. So hopefully that clarifies the questions from chapter 5.